Everyone knows that Bonnie and Clyde were two young lovers running wild, willing to die for each other as they robbed banks and killed in cold blood. But did you know they were also just two kids who were terrified of prison and crippled by horrific injuries? They hit up as many gumball machines as they did banks, and they'd even give their hostages bus fare home. These shocking facts reveal the truth about the terrifying couple, the real motives behind their horrendous crimes, and the public's final revenge upon their mutilated bodies. Did we have the story right all along? Or are you ready to discover a heartbreaking fact that'll shatter the legend of the fearsome Bonnie and Clyde? Prison turned Clyde into a serial killer. When Clyde was just 8 years old, he was arrested for being incorrigible and wandering the streets at night, which landed him at the Harris County School for Boys. There, he was found to be so quiet and conservative that the superintendent took him into his own home to help look after his wife and baby. Hardly the backstory of a cold-blooded killer. That is, until he was sent to Easton Prison Farm. After racking up a record for failing to return a rental car on time, being in possession of a truckload of stolen turkeys, and other petty crimes, Clyde was finally sent to Easton for carjacking. He was just 21 years old, and the experience would transform him from schoolboy to rattlesnake. The prison was notoriously harsh and known to subject its inmates to hard labor, but Clyde suffered worse than most. He was starved, brutally beaten by guards, and repeatedly assaulted by fellow prisoner Ed Crowder. As a small lad at 5'4", Clyde must have seemed like an easy target to the 6', 200-pound Crowder. But after a year of suffering, he snapped. Legend says Clyde cornered Crowder in a bathroom and crushed his skull with a metal pipe. But original newspaper articles explicitly state that Crowder was stabbed 15 times. Either way, his end was as vicious and excruciatingly painful as he deserved. Fortunately for Clyde, he'd befriended a lifer called Aubrey Scally, who graciously took the blame so Clyde wouldn't have extra time added to his sentence. But even with his abuser out of the picture, he still found Easton's grueling work schedule intolerable. Desperate for a way out, he slammed an axe into his foot, removing his left big toe and a portion of the next. He hoped that with a limp, he'd be useless to the farm and would be transferred to a less harsh facility. Unfortunately, unbeknown to him, his mother, Kumi Barrow, had been working for the governor of Texas to get him paroled. She told officials that she'd been widowed and needed Clyde to support her. It was an outright lie, but it worked. She was just waiting for the paperwork to go through when Clyde mutilated himself, and he was released only 6 days later. Bonnie and Clyde hated robbing banks. Bonnie and Clyde are frequently romanticized as infamous bank robbers, hell-bent on stealing from the rich and living it up with their ill-gotten gains. However, the reality is they weren't driven by greed or a quest for wealth, but by revenge. Filled with rage following this treatment at Easton, Clyde became obsessed with raiding the prison, releasing the inmates, and punishing the officers who were implicit in his torment. So, as soon as he was released and reunited with his girlfriend Bonnie, he hooked up with fellow ex-inmate Ralph Fultz, and they started planning a raid. To make it work, they needed money and weapons. But as two ex-cons at the height of the Great Depression, neither was easy to come by. Theft seemed like their only option. They tried their luck at 15 banks during their 2-year crime spree, but Clyde hated it and felt like the extra security made them more trouble than they were worth. Due to the Depression, Southern banks never held much money, and the gang often came away with as little as $80, and the most they ever took was $1,500. So if bank robbery wasn't their MO, how did they become famous for it? Well, thanks to the infamy of John Dillinger, the press knew that bank robberies sold papers, so they were the hits that made the front page. It also allowed them to cast Bonnie and Clyde as Robin Hoods, targeting the evil banks, foreclosing on poor, innocent farmers. In reality, though, the gang spent more time hitting small mom-and-pop grocery stores and gas stations, hurting the very people that were suffering the most. Unsurprisingly, this wasn't particularly lucrative, and the gang often struggled to scrape together enough to eat. It wasn't uncommon to find them breaking into vending machines and even gumball machines just to afford a round of bologna sandwiches. They preferred hostages to murder. Tragically, due to Clyde's absolute terror of being taken back to prison, their relatively small-stakes crimes frequently ended in bloodshed. The gang wasn't afraid to shoot anyone who threatened their freedom, and over their 2-year spree, they murdered 12 people, including 2 store owners, the owner of a car they stole, and 9 members of law enforcement. This is why Bonnie and Clyde are often portrayed as bloodthirsty serial killers. But in truth, neither wanted to kill anyone, and, if possible, they took hostages instead. They'd even go so far as to release their captives with money for bus fare home. In one event, Clyde spotted a Ford V8, his all-time favorite car, and decided to steal it. But as he drove it away, he was spotted by the owner, Dillard Darby, who had no idea that the thief was a serial killer and gave chase in his friend's car. He caught up with Clyde just out of town and went to confront him as the rest of the gang arrived, weapons drawn. Dillard thought it was all over, but Clyde found it hilarious and agreed to let him go free. As the group drove him down to an appropriate drop-off point, Bonnie discovered he was an undertaker and said she hoped he would embalm them when the time came. They gave him $5 for bus fare and sent him on his way with his life, but not his car. On another occasion, a policeman attempted to stop the gang's car, so Clyde pulled into a side street and let him approach. Unfortunately, the police officer, he had no idea who he was dealing with, and when he got to the window, he found a sawed-off shotgun pointed at his face. He turned to run, but they caught him, took his pistol, and bundled him into the back seat. Fleeing the scene, Clyde drove 150 miles until the car's battery died outside a small town. Not wanting to get his hands dirty, he sent gang member W.D. Jones with the officer to steal a battery from a parked car. Fearing for his life, the officer complied and, according to W.D., worked right hard to get that battery in the car like Clyde wanted. When the job was done, they let him go free, and their captive thanked them as they left. Stunned by what we've uncovered about the real nature of Bonnie and Clyde? Like, subscribe, and turn on those notifications, and we'll keep delivering the truth behind the legends. Bonnie wasn't violent. At the height of their spree, 2 photos could be seen in every newspaper across America. One of Bonnie posing with a pistol and a cigar hanging from her mouth, and another showing Bonnie pointing a shotgun at Clyde's chest as he mock surrenders. Thanks to these images, Bonnie was labeled as Clyde's cigar-smoking, quick-shooting woman accomplice. But this couldn't be further from the truth. In reality, Bonnie hated holding a gun, never mind firing one, and it's generally agreed that she never killed anyone. So how did the newspapers get a hold of these infamous photos? Well, the truth is that as young 20-somethings on the run, they were simply messing around and finding amusement where they could. Both Bonnie and Clyde loved posing for photos, and on one occasion, W.D. asked her to hold his cigar while he adjusted the camera. This gave her an idea, so she struck a pose with a pistol, and they turned it into a joke photo shoot. The pictures only made it to the press because W.D. abandoned the undeveloped film when they fled a raid in Joplin. The police recovered it and passed the photos onto the papers to increase public awareness of the dangerous couple. However, their plan backfired, as rather than reacting with fear, the public fell in love with the daring duo. Everything about them was alluring. They were young and attractive enough. Bonnie scandalously smoked a cigar instead of cigarettes, and in one photo, the unmarried couple were kissing in a Hollywood-style embrace. Jim Wright, the former Speaker of the House of Representatives, later recalled, even if you didn't approve of him, you'd still have to envy him a little, to be so good-looking and rich and happy. Overnight, they were catapulted from outlaws to superstars, and the public almost began rooting for them. They suffered horrific injuries and worse treatments. One of the hardest parts of their life on the run was that they could never see a doctor. This was a particular problem, as they were frequently caught up in gun battles. When they could, they'd steal doctors' bags out of parked cars and rob alcohol and salves from drugstores. However, none of the gang had any medical expertise, and the treatment they gave each other was questionable at best. In the raid at Joplin, W.D. was shot in his side and found the stomach pain so bad he was sure shards of the bullet were lodged somewhere inside. Fortunately, or unfortunately, depending on how you look at it, Clyde had an idea. He wrapped an elm branch with gauze and plunged it into the wound. It went all the way through W.D.'s abdomen and out his back, so they concluded the bullet had gone straight through and that it'd heal on its own. Shockingly though, this wasn't the most gruesome injury they dealt with. In June 1933, Clyde was sharpening his getaway skills by driving at top speed. He famously did this in his socks, as his missing toes meant he couldn't balance on the pedals in his shoes. Despite this, he was an unusually expert driver and rarely let anyone else take the wheel. Unfortunately, on this occasion, he was driving so fast that he missed the sign that read "Bridge washed out, road closed." The car flew over the edge, crash-landed in a creek, and shattered apart. Remarkably, they all survived, but the car battery burst and covered Bonnie's right leg in searing acid. Her skin and flesh were eaten away from her hip all the way to her ankle, and she would have died if it hadn't been for a family who witnessed the accident and rushed out to help. They carried her home, neutralized the acid with baking soda, and bandaged her up. However, they also saw the guns in the car and called the police. In true Clyde style, when the officers arrived, he drew his guns, took their car, shoved them in the back seat, and placed Bonnie across their laps. They cared for her so well on the drive that when they reached their destination, Clyde decided they should live. He told his brother Buck to tie him up in the woods while they made their escape. Unfortunately, Buck, who shared his brother's usual hatred for the law, did it in barbed wire. Although her leg healed, Bonnie could never walk on it again, and she spent the rest of her life hopping or being carried. The public turned against them right at the end. In January 1934, Clyde finally managed to pull off his raid of Easton Prison, which resulted in 5 escaped convicts and the death of prison official Major Crowson. The tragedy lit a fire under Texas and the government, and they hired Texas Ranger Captain Frank Hammer to bring him in dead or alive. But public opinion still remained largely on their side. However, this would quickly change on Easter Sunday 1934. Bonnie and Clyde, along with fellow gang member Henry Methvin, were sleeping in their car when they were approached by 2 policemen who they thought were stranded motorists. As the men weren't hostile, Clyde decided they should be taken captive and released along the road. Unfortunately, his instruction, "Let's take him," was a bit ambiguous, and Methvin took it as an order to open fire. Both policemen were killed with their pistols still in their holsters. Now, Bonnie and Clyde had murdered lawmen before, but this was worse. One of the men was 22-year-old H.D. Murphy. He'd only been serving as a state trooper for 6 months and was just 12 days away from getting married. This made him both the youngest and shortest-serving highway patrolman to be killed in the line of duty. Then, to add fuel to the fire, his fiancée attended his funeral in the wedding dress she would have worn had he lived. The story was gold for the newspapers, and they spent weeks sensationalizing the tale, claiming Bonnie fired the killing shot at Murphy, and laughed when his head bounced like a rubber ball as it hit the ground. The public was outraged. Several officials announced rewards totaling $26 grand for their dead bodies, and the Dallas Journal ran a cartoon depicting an empty electric chair with the words "Clyde and Bonnie" and a sign that read "Reserve." Their bodies were raided for souvenirs. On the 23rd of May 1934, a 6-man posse, led by Captain Hamer, lay in wait in the bushes at the side of Louisiana State Highway 154. They'd struck a deal with Methvin's dad, Ivy, who'd agreed to set a trap for Bonnie and Clyde in exchange for his son's freedom. So that morning, Ivy positioned himself at the side of the road, next to a seemingly broken-down truck, hoping Clyde would stop to help him. Sure enough, hours later, when the duo drove by, Clyde slowed just enough for the posse to unleash a hailstorm of bullets on the car. He was killed instantly, and some say Bonnie had just enough time to scream in terror at the sight before dying by his side. Not taking any chances, the officers gave him everything they had. They opened fire with automatic rifles, then approached with shotguns, and finally emptied their pistols into the car as it lay steaming in a ditch. The last of 130 rounds fired were clearly unnecessary as Clyde's fractured head had collapsed through the spokes of the steering wheel. Bonnie lay slumped with a half-eaten bologna sandwich in her hand, and the inside of the car was peppered with blood and gore. The police had been promised they could have anything in Bonnie and Clyde's possession when they made the kill. So they quickly raided the car, removing 3 Browning automatic rifles, 2 sawed-off shotguns, and 11 pistols. They also took a fishing tackle box, a stash of true crime magazines, and Clyde's saxophone as souvenirs to sell off later. But it wasn't just the policemen who realized the value of Bonnie and Clyde memorabilia. As the officers headed into town to call their bosses, locals swarmed the crash site. They dug bullets out of trees with pocket knives and frantically collected the shell casings. This was distasteful enough, but things got worse when the death car, with their bodies still inside, was towed to the morgue. The journey was a circus. At least 200 cars followed them, and at one point, the tow truck broke down. Horrifically, this occurred right out of Gibbsland's primary school at recess. The children went wild, reached in, and pulled the sheet that was covering the bodies. They were greeted by the terrifying sight of the bullet-riddled corpses, and one student, Polly Palmer, still remembers the way Bonnie's near-detached lip hung loosely from the corner of her mouth. When the procession finally reached its destination in Arcadia, 16,000 people mobbed the vehicle, pulling shattered glass from the windows and breaking off what they could. One man attempted to cut off Clyde's ear, and another went after his trigger finger but was interrupted. Bonnie suffered the worst of it as a souvenir hunter succeeded in cutting off locks of her hair and swaths of her bloody dress. Eventually, they made it to the funeral parlor, where the cause of death was unsurprisingly found to be bullet wounds. In a strange twist of fate, the assistant embalmer turned out to be Dillard Darby, the man they'd once kidnapped and whom Bonnie had hoped would work on their bodies. Unfortunately, Dillard struggled with the job as Clyde's 17 and Bonnie's 26 bullet holes meant it was tricky getting the embalming fluid to stay in them. Their final wish was never granted. After the chaos of their embalming, it's no surprise that the funerals were just as crazed. Both funeral homes agreed to make the bodies available for visitation, which the families later agreed was a huge mistake. Clyde went first, and the Sparkman-Holtz-Brand Funeral Home was overrun with 10,000 drunk and unruly tourists. One even took the opportunity to offer Clyde's parents $50,000 for his body, which he intended to mummify and present as part of a traveling show. Fortunately, Bonnie's presentation was much more reserved, and although 20,000 people arrived, they were generally more respectful of the grieving family. She was laid to rest in a white veil to disguise her disfigured face and received the largest floral arrangement from the Dallas newsboys who'd sold 500,000 extra papers detailing the couple's demise. Every part of their funerals and burials likely went the way the couple had imagined, except for one thing, inseparable in life. Their final wish had been to be buried together. Bonnie even included it in her poem, The Ballad of Bonnie and Clyde. She wrote, "Someday they'll all go down together, and they'll bury them side by side. To a few, it'll be grief, to the law, a relief, but it's death for Bonnie and Clyde." However, when the time came, Bonnie's mother outright refused, stating, "Clyde had her for 2 years. Look what he did to her. She's mine now. No one has any right to her." So Bonnie was buried at Crown Hill Memorial Park, and Clyde was buried 9 miles away at Western Heights, where an empty plot for Bonnie remains to this day. Clyde's family even went so far as to leave a gap when burying his mother, and his uncle kept watch over the empty plot and removed a mulberry tree when it attempted to take her space. No one dared to broach the subject with Bonnie's mother while she was alive, but many now feel that the two should be reunited, and time's running out. The authorities require permission from a relative to move a grave, and Bonnie only has 2 left, 88-year-old Raylene Linder and her daughter. The pair are keen to get the body moved, but money and permission are issues. They need to pay an attorney for the court order, the cost of exhumation, and a new coffin and headstone. Plus, Crown Hill Memorial Park is questioning their authority over that of Bonnie's own mother, who's now buried with her. While it's true that the love-struck couple's story was tragic, they also killed many innocent men and terrorized many more. Should they really be granted their final wish in death when they robbed 12 victims of their lives? And should Bonnie once again be taken from her mother, who previously proclaimed, "He had her in life, he can't have her in death"? What do you think? If you'd like to support us and discover more untold stories and horrific tales, like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Then let us know in the comments which incredible subject you'd like us to uncover next.